So she dates both of these brothers. Hi, I'm Catherine. You can call me Kat, and welcome to my channel. I talk about books and pop culture on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Today we're talking about everyone's favorite trope, the love triangle. Love triangles are so love or hate for me. Mostly hate, but sometimes when there is a good one, it is really fun. The main problem with love triangles for me is that usually the end game is so obvious. There's nothing more annoying than when you can tell what the writers of a story want you to think or want you to feel, and I feel like that happens so often with love triangles because they want you to root for the right love interest, and so they'll make the secondary love interest really boring or annoying or an outright villain. A proper love triangle will actually give you options, and good options. I will be tier ranking iconic love triangles from books and movies. Some of these are just iconic to me, but I think most of them will be very well known. And obviously I'm not going to get to every iconic love triangle that there is in the world, so maybe I'll do a part 2 if there's interest. But without further ado, let's get into it. The highly scientific, very objective tier ranking system that I have developed. At the very top, we have a triangle is the strongest shape. So these are proper love triangles. Each individual character brings something different to the dynamic. Each individual relationship within this love triangle brings something different. There are 3 relationships. It's not just a love angle where 2 people want the same person. There's also something going on down here as well. In this dynamic, each of the characters and each of their relationships helps to drive the story forward. Second tier is launch the ship wars. Each of the options are good enough that we have people willing to go to bat for their ships, even if they're obviously not the end game. And I would also put in this category anything that is like a cultural moment. Our third tier, which is kind of neutral, is fine, it's for the plot. These love triangles serve a larger purpose. Maybe they show something about the characters or they drive the plot forward. The love triangle isn't necessarily the point of the story, but the characters and their relationships will be developed enough to add something to the story that we wouldn't get otherwise. The fourth category is give us crumbs, but I'll still eat. These characters and relationships may not be fully developed. The options that we have may be not totally great, but somehow I'm still invested. I do still care. In our very last category, we have an F for effort. These are for the love triangles where the endgame is so painfully obvious that whenever the alternate love interest shows up, you're kind of just like, this is a waste of my time. The secondary love interest will usually have the depth of a piece of paper, or they're just really obviously a plot device with some dude's name. That's our system. Let's get ranking. I will admit that I was inspired to make this video because I watched the movie Challengers. If you have not seen it, do yourself a favor and go see it. I will not be giving away any spoilers, but you probably already know that Challengers is about Zendaya and the 2 white boys of the month. Zendaya plays Tashi Duncan, an up-and-coming tennis star who later becomes a coach. Josh O'Connor and Mike Feist play Patrick and Art respectively, and they are 2 tennis players. When I first saw the trailer, I thought this was going to be your typical love triangle, you know, 2 guys who want the same woman, blah blah blah. But the reviews started coming out and I realized it's not just about that, because the 2 guys also want each other. So this makes it a proper love triangle. Beautiful. Like I said, I don't want to give anything away, but Challengers is supremely satisfying because each of the 3 characters brings something very unique to the dynamic, and the relationships between each of the characters is also very defined. They each want something different from each other and they get something different from each other. So Tashi is this kind of ice queen, unattainable woman, and Patrick is this kind of dominant, charismatic tennis player, and they kind of butt heads. And Art is more, I don't know if I want to say submissive, but he gives pathetic, and we love that. Art is more baby girl. And so we have this dynamic between Patrick and Tashi who really challenge each other and are constantly in conflict because of that. And then Art, who is kind of the foil for their characters, but his relationship to each of them is very different as well. When you get the balance of all 3 of these characters coming together, it is absolutely spectacular to watch. There was one interview with the actors where the interviewer was asking if you could give your characters any advice, what would it be? I think that was the question. And Josh O'Connor, who plays Patrick, was like, they should all find a way to live together. And that to me is the makings of a perfect love triangle. So to me, Challengers belongs in the top tier of love triangles. This movie should be framed as an example of what all love triangles should aspire to. It's perfect, no notes, 10 out of 10. Speaking of movies that I loved, I want to talk about Past Lives next. Past Lives is a movie directed by Celine Song, and if you haven't seen this movie either, you need to go watch it as well. Celine Song and the writer of Challengers are also married. I don't know what they put in the movies that they write, but I am eating out of their hands. Past Lives is about a Korean woman who immigrates from Korea to Canada when she's, I think, 12 years old, and then she moves to New York and becomes a playwright. Later on in life, she reconnects with her childhood best friend who is still living in Korea. They never actually have a romantic relationship, but there is something there. But unfortunately, they part ways. And then she meets her husband, who is another writer in New York. Many years after she's married, she reconnects with his childhood friend again, and he actually visits her in New York. And that is where we get the love triangle. A lot of the tension in this movie comes from this will they, won't they between Nora and her childhood friend. But you're also seeing this really healthy and loving relationship that she has with her husband. And it's really clear that both of these men see and have access to a different part of her. There's this really beautiful line where her husband says that she dreams in Korean, and so there's that part of her that he can't ever access because he is not Korean. But on the other hand, she's also grown and moved on from that girl she was in Korea. For me, the core story in Past Lives is not really about the love triangle or wondering which guy she would choose. The love triangle itself was more of an analogy for the choices that Nora has had to make because she has immigrated. She has one relationship representing the path that she's chosen to become the person she is now, and she has one relationship representing what could have been if she had stayed in Korea. Past Lives is one of my favorite movies, and I wrote a whole article about how it's really this extended metaphor for immigration and not really a love story, and I'll link that below. So to me, it fits perfectly in fine is for the plot. The love triangle is an incredibly effective plot device. It's not just there, it actually serves a really big purpose for the overarching theme of the movie. How could I make a video about love triangles without talking about probably the most iconic love triangle, Twilight? However you may feel about Twilight, I don't think you can argue that this love triangle between Bella, Edward, and Jacob, I don't think you can argue that this hasn't had significant cultural impact, for better or worse. I think it is pretty obvious that the endgame was always Edward, but I will say that New Moon, where Edward was barely in there and it was all about Jacob, that did convince me for a while that like maybe Jacob was the better choice until the non-consensual kiss, and then I was like, oh, then I got icked out. I think Twilight is a good example of a love triangle where both love interests are well developed enough. I won't say they are well developed characters, but they are well developed enough to where you have people really rooting for one or really rooting for the other. And I also think there are valid reasons for people in either camp. For Team Jacob, you know, there's the fact that he is her age. He is not like ice cold like a rock. Was it New Moon or Eclipse where he keeps her warm in a tent? That was like a big argument for Jacob for some reason. Jacob most probably would not end up accidentally killing or eating Bella. Same for Jacob's like friends and family. You know, that's certainly a plus in a love interest. And then of course for Team Edward, you're like, oh, he can turn her into a vampire and she can live forever, which is also kind of cool. Edward's also really rich because I guess they've been investing a lot since they've been alive for so long. So I would say there are valid reasons for either team. Whichever team you're on, I get it. Like, I see both sides. I do think it was effective to have Jacob as a secondary love interest because this relationship really exemplified all of the challenges that she would have if she were to choose Edward. This is probably like the love triangle that everyone thinks of when you think of a love triangle in like movies and books. You cannot argue that it wasn't culture defining. So I would have to put this in Launch the Ship Wars. Now, if you were to talk about the love triangle between Bella, Jacob, and Renesmee? That's straight to jail. Moving on to something a little more contemporary, let's talk about The Summer I Turned Pretty. In The Summer I Turned Pretty, there's a love triangle between Belly, the main character, and the two brothers that she is childhood friends with. There is, I think, Connor, who is the older brother, and then Jeremiah, who is the younger brother. She is into both, and they are both into her. And it is extremely, extremely messy, as you might imagine, when two siblings fight over the same girl. This is a YA book series that has been adapted into a Netflix show, so this is a book series written for children. In an act of self-hatred, I went and read the summaries for the books, and I found out what happens at the end, so I will not be spoiling that, and this will be based on the show. So in the story, Bella not Bella, Belly. Belly has always had a huge crush on the older brother. I think his name is Connor, but I'm gonna look it up just to be sure. Oh, his name is Conrad. Ellie has always had this huge crush on Conrad. She thinks that he is her man. They are meant to be. I forgot how much older he is than her, but he is a little bit older. I think she's like a junior in high school and he is in his first year of college. And Conrad has a younger brother, Jeremiah, who is, I think, the same age as her. Belly and Conrad have a couple of moments where it seems like maybe something will happen between them, but at the same time, Jeremiah, who is really flirty with everyone, begins to also show interest in Belly. In season 1, Belly and Conrad kiss, and then season 2 they start dating, but then they break up. And then I think Belly and Jeremiah get together by the end of season 2. So she dates both of these brothers. So here's the thing about this love triangle. Yes, we have people on both sides rooting for Team Conrad or Team Jeremiah, but I am team neither. I am team maybe date outside the family. It feels like Belly just kind of imprints on these boys because they're who she grew up with, and she doesn't really try looking outside of this family for love interests. So the reasons why I don't like either love interest, so Conrad is emotionally unavailable. He's totally unable to talk about his feelings. He just shuts down. And I know I said I would only rate this based on the show, but in the books, Jeremiah is kind of toxic and does some things in, I think, like the 3rd book that I just would not be able to forgive. And I think it's pretty obvious that Belly doesn't actually really love Jeremiah. She's just kind of using him as a placeholder for Conrad, who she sees as her endgame, even though he's like giving us nothing. I will have to put this in, give us crumbs, but I'll still eat, because as much as I kind of hate the entire love triangle and every relationship and every character, even though I know what happens at the end because I read the summaries of the books, I'm still gonna watch season 3. I don't know what they put in this show. I can't stop myself. We do have to give the writers points for that. Alright, we're going back in time to The Notebook. In The Notebook, the main character, played by Rachel McAdams, has a love triangle between Noah, played by Ryan Gosling, and I think his name is Lon, played by James Marsden. Obviously, her endgame is Ryan Gosling, but they are torn apart because of class differences and how her family doesn't approve, and she ends up being engaged to James Marsden. And to be frank, James Marsden's character is actually like really sweet to her. He treats her really well. He's not like a bad secondary love interest, which I really appreciate. I hate it when there's a love triangle and one of them is so obviously like the villain. It has been a long time since I've watched The Notebook, but I think the older I get, the more I'm like, justice for Lon. He gets cheated on, but he's still like, I'll still take you back. He literally does nothing wrong, but a lot of fans of the main couple are like, oh, he's the villain, just because he's like the choice that's more acceptable to her family, but he himself doesn't really do anything wrong. But having him as this alternate love interest that she ultimately rejects in favor of Noah is supposed to show us that their relationship transcends all of these societal barriers. It's supposed to be more romantic because Noah on paper is like the wrong choice, but he's the one that, you know, she has the most feelings for. So whether or not you agree with that choice, I do think that it makes a good point that with matters of the heart, a lot of times the choice that your heart makes is not going to be the logical one. The love triangle serves a greater purpose, so I'm going to put it in fine, it's for the plot. Of course, we have to talk about the Hunger Games. In the Hunger Games, the love triangle is between Katniss, the main character, and Peeta and Gale. Gale is her childhood best friend. She's always kind of had a crush on him, but he's never really noticed her. He is kind of your typical YA love interest. He's really moody. He's like tall and has like dark hair, I guess. And Peeta is the baker's son. He like threw her a loaf of bread once when she was really hungry, and he gets sent into the games with her. And he represents this like softer, more kind sort of masculinity. It's a perfect example of how these two different love interests represent different paths that Katniss can take. As we learn later on with Gale's involvement in the Resistance, he represents this more intense, perhaps more violent type of rebellion and strength that Katniss also has inside of her. And then Peeta is a more balancing type of presence for Katniss because he is all the things that she is not. In the end, she does choose Peeta because Gale does something unforgivable, you know, war crimes and all. I read the books as they came out, and I think at first I was Team Gale because, as I said, he is your typical YA love interest. I think that Peeta is canonically a short king. So I think my middle school self read like, oh, Gale was tall and he was brooding, and I was like, that's my man. But it's so funny because I reread The Hunger Games as an adult, and Peeta actually has so much Riz in the books, and by the end of the series I was 100% team Peeta. But I think that the book does a really great job of showing this kind of like slow burn development of their relationship, which I think is a really nice message to have, especially for a book geared towards younger audiences and girls. Like, when I think about it, The Hunger Games actually had a really great messaging for like healthy relationships, in addition to all of the other commentary that The Hunger Games has. Every time I think about The Hunger Games, the more relevant it is in so many different ways. I'm putting The Hunger Games in Launch the Ship Wars. The only reason that this is not like a top tier love triangle is because it's an angle, it's not a triangle. Next, we're talking about another Netflix series, To All the Boys I've Loved Before. In the second movie, there is a love triangle between Laura Jean, Peter Kavinsky, and John Ambrose, who is one of the other boys that she sent letters to. I just want justice for John Ambrose because he was so sweet. But it was really obvious, at least to me throughout the movie, that Laura Jean was just always going to like Peter and he was her endgame. So it just kind of sucked. Like, it just felt bad. And while on the one hand it was great that they recast John Ambrose to be a man of color, it was also kind of sucky for him to be cast as a man of color only to be rejected in favor of the white boy. I think this particular love triangle also suffers from the problem where the secondary love interest is actually more compelling or just like a better person than the main love interest. I think it was trying to do the same thing as like The Notebook, where Laura Jean was supposed to pick the person who wasn't like perfect on paper but who she loved more. But it didn't really work for me in this one because they made like John Ambrose like too nice and Peter Kavinsky like too mid. To All the Boys is going to get our first failing grade. It is an F for effort. Changing it up again, we're going to talk about Pride and Prejudice. I think most people forget that Pride and Prejudice actually has a love triangle. Obviously there's Mr. Darcy, who is the main love interest, but there's also Mr. Wickham, who is the secondary love interest for a short while in the book. And he is also the villain because he has a pattern of absconding with younger girls. In modern parlance, if he were to strike a chord, it would be A minor. But this is a great example of a love triangle where the alternate love interest is the villain, but we are so in like the main character's head and point of view that we don't realize that until she realizes that. Wickham is incredibly important to the plot. It's not really about the fact that Lizzie has the secondary love interest. Wickham doesn't really exist for us to ship them together. He exists to deceive us and manipulate us and Lizzie and stand as an obstacle between Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. In the 2005 adaptation, Wickham really comes across as this very charismatic and handsome person, but I think in the 1995 BBC adaptation, the actor who plays Wickham is a lot older and probably more accurate to the actual age that Wickham is supposed to be. So when you see the age gap between this actor playing Wickham and the actor playing Lizzie's younger sister, it becomes very, very obvious how predatory this character is. This particular love triangle I'm putting in fine, it's for the plot. It's not really for us to ship one relationship over the other because the endgame is always Mr. Darcy. But Wickham not only creates this obstacle to the relationship, he also shows Lizzie's flaws because she is so presumptuous in believing him over Mr. Darcy, and also shows the kind of man that Mr. Darcy is because of how he reacts to not only what Wickham does to his younger sister, but to Lizzie's family as well. I also want to add that I think a lot of love triangles in classic literature would fall into this category. For example, there is a love triangle in Emma, and I think that love triangle does more to showcase a heroine's flaws than to add like romantic interest to the story. The last Netflix adaptation I'll talk about, I swear, Never Have I Ever. In Never Have I Ever, Davy, the main character, is in a love triangle between, I want to say Winston, but it's not Winston. Paxton Hall Yoshida, I think. She's in a love triangle between Paxton, who's like the hottest person at their school, and Ben, I think, who is like her arch nemesis, her academic arch nemesis. I find this love triangle fun and interesting to watch, but it is kind of weird that they cast someone who looks like he's in his late 30s, and like the actor who actually plays Davy was like I think 17 when they started filming. It is kind of like weird to watch. The other love interests, Ben, they give a lot of good character development to and relationship development for these two characters to actually begin to like each other. Davy does end up with Ben at the end, which I guess it made sense. But once again, we have our main character who is a woman of color choosing the white man over the man of color. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't, but I'll just leave that fact there. I didn't really love either love interest for her. I would have been just as happy if she had ended up alone and working on herself and had met someone new in college maybe. I also wasn't a huge fan of how Ben and Davy's relationship started because he was so mean to her in the beginning, and he continues to be mean to her for quite a while until like maybe the end of season 1. That being said, this was one of my favorite shows on Netflix to watch. It was deliciously messy, and the love triangle was definitely part of it. It was just fun to watch. I'm gonna put this in Give Us Crumbs, but I'll still eat. The last one that I'll talk about is Iron Widow, and this is not really an iconic love triangle because the book came out pretty recently, but it is the only other example I could think of that would end up in the first category. If you haven't read Iron Widow, it is a fantasy series based on historical China. In this world, the people have to fight these aliens that live beyond the Great Wall, and they do so by piloting these giant mechas. The main character is on a revenge mission because her sister was killed by one of these pilots. She's trying to kill the pilot who murdered her sister. The love triangle here is between that main character, one of the other pilots, and her childhood best friend. It is a polyamorous relationship, so it does subvert the YA trope of a love triangle where there are two love interests who are only into the main character. I love both the boyfriends individually, and I also love the boyfriends becoming boyfriends. So if you liked Challengers, the movie, and you want that vibe in like a fantasy series, I really recommend Iron Widow. It does kind of have Hunger Game vibes as well, but again with a polyamorous love triangle. It's also kind of a Challengers dynamic with the love triangle, with the pilot guy being more like intense and broody, and the childhood best friend is more baby girl. It is really great, and they have great communication, which I love to see in books with relationships. It's so rare. The only other example I can think of that might possibly fit in the first category is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney, but that is more of a love square than a love triangle, so I didn't put it in there officially. But if you can think of any other examples, I would really love to read your recommendations. Whatever was in Challengers, I want more of it. If you've watched this far, thank you so much for watching. If you disagreed with me about any of these love triangles, we can fight in the comments. Just kidding, I don't really care. If you want me to do a part 2, or if there were other love triangles that you were like, they're so iconic, how did she not talk about them? You can leave them down below. If you like this video, you can give it a like, you can subscribe, you can find me on my socials. If you didn't like it, that's okay, I'll get over it eventually. See you next time, bye!